Could the Royal Navy be used to stop small boats carrying migrants across the English Channel into the UK? That is what the political party Reform UK want to do if they win the next general election. But would it be legal, and could it actually work? And we'll also be discussing what happened in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta over the weekend, where 60,000 migrants were able to swim from Morocco into the Spanish territory in events which have led to a political storm across Europe. We'll discuss all of that on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's James in Glasgow.
And hello, it's Henry in Westminster.
Now, Henry, we can go on to what Reform UK have actually announced today in a minute, because they held this news conference and there was news from the news conference. But before that, it's fair to say they've had a tough old time, Nigel Farage and his crew, over the past few months, haven't they? What's been going on?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been an escalating intensity, I think, of questions for Nigel Farage and, in some instances, for other leading figures in Reform UK about Nigel Farage's finances and about the financing of Reform UK. And the big question facing Nigel Farage, which has only grown over the past few months, is the circumstances of the £5 million gift which he received from Christopher Harborne, Thai-based crypto billionaire, in the run-up to the 2024 general election, which Nigel Farage insists was completely independent of his subsequent decision to re-enter politics and get elected, as he ultimately managed to do in the 2024 general election as the MP for Clacton. Obviously, there is a by-election going on in Clacton, which Nigel Farage called essentially because of the questions that he has been facing and the parliamentary standards investigation that he has faced about those matters. But I think what you saw from Reform UK today was an attempt, especially in the slightly quieter news environment of the summer where Parliament isn't sitting, to regain the initiative on a policy area where they are at their most comfortable.
Yeah, they've reached for the lever marked immigration, which is standard fare, I suppose, if you're in Reform UK and you feel you're in trouble, because it is very much at the heart of their appeal to voters, and certainly the heart of their perceived appeal to voters. And they made this announcement today, Henry, that if Reform UK were to win power, if Nigel Farage were to become Prime Minister, that they would use the Royal Navy to intercept small boats crossing the English Channel from France, or indeed, I suppose, Belgium as well. Tell us a bit more. Tell newscasters who maybe didn't see that, maybe some newscasters did, but what did Nigel Farage and others have to say?
Well, I think it's important to just say that this is a hardening up of Reform's position on small boats and how they would stop them. In the past, Nigel Farage has been open to the idea that there would be some sort of intercepting of small boats in the Channel, potentially using the armed forces. He's not ruled it out, but he's suggested in interviews in the past that it would be something more like a last resort if other measures, in particular mass deportation of illegal immigrants who've made it to the UK, did not work. What's changed today, courtesy of what they're calling Operation Fortress, complete with policy document, is that is now essentially Plan A. They say that the Royal Navy would intercept vessels and rather than sort of turning back those boats, which Nigel Farage was saying today would be too risky, they would, it seems, kind of offboard the people on the boats onto Royal Navy vessels and then take them to France or to Belgium, depending on where the boats came from. And Nigel Farage's contention is that those countries would ultimately feel compelled to accept them.
Well, let's have a listen to Zia Youssef, the Home Affairs spokesperson for Reform UK, speaking on the BBC's Today programme on Radio 4 earlier today about this topic.
Our document envisages two scenarios, one in which the French consent, which, of course, things are more straightforward. In the event that they do not consent, the Marines will nevertheless, given it's a humanitarian mission, and they are obliged, not only under the ECHR Article 2, which, of course, Reform will leave immediately, but for what it's worth, the current situation, it's there. Article 2 demands the protection of life. North of 170 illegal migrants have already died making this journey. It's one of the most hazardous journeys that is routinely made in the world in terms of maritime, the maritime situation. So they will escort the migrants onto the beaches of France. And if the French disagree, what will end up happening is we'll end up having something of an argument with the French.
Well, lots of questions. See, there's a couple, there's lots. There are many questions, Henry, here. Many questions. I suppose one of them is this lawful under international law? I mean, am I right in saying that most lawyers' understanding of international conventions is that you just can't take someone back to another country without their permission? Is that right?
That is certainly the interpretation of lots of people we've heard from in response to this announcement, international lawyers and so on. Reform UK argue that actually this would be justified under international law because they are protecting life, because as Zia Youssef was pointing out at length in the press conference, this is a perilous journey that people make across the English Channel, and they say this would be justified by stopping people making this perilous journey, where sadly some people do regularly die making that crossing. Look, we're not international lawyers, so we can't make that determination, but I think it is fair to say that it is the prevailing sort of assumptions of those who look at these matters is that this would be legally tricky. I think really, though, what Reform UK are banking on is that the diplomatic question would be settled before the legal question. If there were a Reform UK government which were to enact this policy immediately or near immediately after taking office, I think they are essentially banking on the idea that if they take these people to the French coast and attempt to offload them to France, then there would then be a diplomatic process between France and the UK, which they hope would result in some sort of situation where France would agree to take them. I think
a diplomatic process is a very
it would be undiplomatic. Sure. No, fair point. I mean, I guess what I mean by diplomatic process is that this would be a country to country. I mean, actually, it would be a diplomatic crisis, wouldn't it? Let's be frank. Yeah. That's what it would be in that scenario. Although, in the world in which Reform UK are in government here, let's remember France will have had a presidential election most likely by then, and of course, it's possible that Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella, who are pretty ideologically simpatico with Nigel Farage, would be the French president by then. Of course, there are other potentials, very different ideological hues who could become the French president. So look, we don't know, but I think you can be safe to say that it would not merely be a legal question if this policy were enacted. There would be all sorts of other questions as well.
Yeah, and one of those questions is about the practicality of this. Downing Street has said that border patrol officers are the best suited candidates to deal with such operations, dealing with small boat crossings. And I'll just, we've got a bit of a statement from Downing Street. Let me just read you a couple of bits of it. You've heard it, Henry, and maybe some newscasters have too. But just to recap, Downing Street said when the Royal Navy had primacy for these small boat crossings in 2022, there was no reduction during that period. Says the Royal Navy is already tackling many threats, including monitoring Russian warships, for example, protecting our waters, critical national infrastructure. And it goes on to talk in detail about how border patrol officers, in Downing Street's view, have significant capabilities and skills that make them the best suited candidate. And they also point out, they say they're driving down the number of crossings down almost 50% compared to last year. That's Downing Street's view. This is what a retired Royal Navy commander, Tom Sharp, thought in terms of the practicalities of the plans.
I think it lacks quite a lot of substance. It does feel like Operation Isotrope, as you say, in January 22, when Priti Patel, who was Home Secretary, kind of lobbed this grenade at the Navy and said, fix it, and then really didn't empower them to fix many of the things that they could have helped with. So I think there's a notion that the Royal Navy can steam over the horizon and fix this problem, which, as you say, is declining slightly anyway.
Now, Henry, back then to the Prime Minister, Andy Burnham. Even now, I'm still getting used to that. The Prime Minister, Andy Burnham.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, being in Dover at the weekend, talking about small boats, as this whole thing is sort of journalist shorthand known. But are his plans not quite similar to those of the man who we were also used to just about calling Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer?
Yeah, identical as far as I could tell from what Andy Burnham said yesterday. He talked about how progress had been made. He said he wasn't complacent and that he said there was more to do. But there was no indication that the more that he wants to do would deviate particularly from the approach that Sir Keir Starmer took in office, which is to strengthen international cooperation with France, among others, as a means of sort of combating the people smuggling gangs, and hoping that and other measures prove more of a disincentive, as well as putting more staff into specifically attempting to disrupt these crossings and so on. Look, I think on one level, James, not a surprise at all that Andy Burnham appears to be signalling continuity with Sir Keir Starmer on this issue, because after all, he has kept on Keir Starmer's Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood. So it would be quite something if she were then to take a radically different approach to small boats and illegal immigration and asylum under Andy Burnham compared to what she did under Sir Keir Starmer. And Andy Burnham was pointing to stats which do suggest that things, so far at least this year, have moved in the right direction. To this point in 2026, compared to up to this point in 2025, the number of people who've made the crossing is down about 43%.
Now, Henry, as you said at the start of this, there are also a lot of questions for Nigel Farage in terms of donations and his return to Parliament. And you asked Nigel Farage about that today. And here is what he said to you.
Oh, well, questions about money could go on for years, you know. I mean, look, I had no intention of returning to politics or as leader of Reform. But in the spring of that year, I did talk to Richard Tice about what the liabilities would be if I was to come back to that position. And you'd be a bit of a mug, wouldn't you, to walk into a job and not find out what the potential liabilities were. And they were substantial. They were substantial. In fact, without Richard, the party wouldn't have even survived. So that was useful for me to know, but it wasn't a deal, it wasn't an agreement, it was subject to if I came back. And if you want clarification on this, that came quite some time after the gift, which is perhaps the important point.
Henry, what did you make of Mr. Farage's response to you on that topic?
Well, quite a significant admission, because the Sunday Times reported this at the weekend, and they've led the way on much of the reporting about Nigel Farage and the questions around his finances and Reform UK's finances. But this was confirmation in public from Nigel Farage that the thrust of what they reported at the weekend was correct. Look, and as Nigel Farage said there, he's absolutely right. The important question is how the timeline of these discussions with Richard Tice aligns with the timeline of the £5 million gift that he received from Christopher Harborne, because Nigel Farage's defence about why he didn't need to declare that gift is that it was unconnected to his political activity, because at that point he was not entertaining the possibility of going back into politics. So that's why he made such a point there in his answer to me of saying that these discussions with Richard Tice were subsequent to the gift he received from Christopher Harborne.
Now, just finally, before you dance off into the rehearsal studio, Henry, for your future Strictly career, are we getting closer to the possibility of a pact between Reform and Restore? In fact, not everyone, maybe not some, again, as always, lots of newscasters will know about Restore, but just remind us who Restore are, how that came about, because there was a breakaway to form Restore in the first place. Are those wounds being healed?
It's such a fascinating question. So Restore is a party led by Rupert Lowe. He was one of the 5 MPs elected as a Reform UK MP at the 2024 general election. Great Yarmouth. Mastermind, or perhaps even a more niche quiz show, might one day ask the question of which football club Rupert Lowe owned and chaired in the early Premier League years. It was Southampton. So some people will remember him from those days. But he is now the leader of Restore, having fallen out with Nigel Farage and actually, it seems, pretty well everyone else in Reform UK. But he has built up a significant online following, and we are now seeing across electoral contests that there are people who want to vote for Restore, who believe that it offers a more compelling pitch on the right of British politics than Reform UK. I think it's fair to say Restore has pitched itself, certainly on immigration matters and cultural matters, to the right of Reform UK. And they got a fairly significant amount of votes in the Greater Manchester mayoral by-election just last week. If those votes had all gone to Reform UK, Labour still would have won that contest, but it would have been a bit closer. They also got a reasonable number of votes at the Makerfield by-election. And that is why, actually, with a fair dose of candour, Nigel Farage said in the press conference today that while he did not believe Restore could win much at a general election, they were a threat to Reform's ability to win, because they are chipping away at reform's support from the right. Now, Rupert Lowe appeared to offer some sort of pact to Nigel Farage on social media on Sunday. Nigel Farage today was talking about, well, if it was a serious offer, then it wouldn't have been communicated via social media, but he said that they had been trying to get in touch with each other on the phone. Since the press conference, Rupert Lowe is sort of quibbling with who had been offering to call whom and when. And so all of that does exemplify the level of personal animosity here. But nevertheless, I don't think this is the last we've heard of efforts to knit those two forces together, because it does appear that they are, to some degree at least, fishing in the same pool for voters.
Yeah, really interesting. And you mentioned by-elections, and earlier you mentioned the Clacton by-election, Henry, and I should just say there is a full list of candidates on the BBC website. You can just search Clacton by-election. It's quite an interesting list. It's not the usual list. No Labour, Liberal, Democrats, Conservatives or Greens, but lots of others. It's quite a read. Henry, thank you very much.
Thank you, James.
Now, we're going to stay with the topic of immigration, because over the weekend you might have seen these dramatic pictures of tens of thousands of people trying to swim into the Spanish city of Ceuta on Thursday. Now, it is, although I say the Spanish city, we need to explain that it's in fact in North Africa, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But they were migrants coming from Morocco. And to help us understand why they came in such numbers and what it's meaning for Spain, its relationship with Morocco, its relationship with the rest of the European Union, with us are Aitor Hernández-Morales, who's senior reporter at Politico. Hello, Aitor.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. And Greg Holyoke, who is Middle East North Africa specialist for BBC Monitoring. Hi, Greg.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Thank you so much. Now, this is slightly more complicated than people crossing into Spain. Greg, can you just explain to us where this territory is, what it is, where it is? Because it's across the Strait of Gibraltar. It's on the other side of the Mediterranean from Spain, but it is Spanish, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's been under Spanish control since the 17th century. And actually was, interestingly, one of the points from the Moorish conquest, the opposite direction into Spain. And I think that's something we've seen in some far-right narratives as well coming in. So it is Spanish territory. It's also an autonomous region. So it's not completely sort of controlled by Madrid. And it's also not recognized by Morocco formally as Spanish territory, which creates a kind of strange border situation. But we do see Spanish and Moroccan border control on both sides of that.
Yeah, well, facing Gibraltar on the other side, I suppose that's something with which people might be familiar as a concept in terms of a contested bit of land. Aitor, tell us what happened then on this bit of land on Thursday, because initially I heard the reports coming out, newscasters probably heard them as well, and they were saying maybe hundreds, and then it became clear it was a lot bigger than that. What actually happened?
So the latest estimates that we're working with is that around 60,000 people crossed over into this autonomous city that is a Spanish possession and has been, as you were mentioning, since 1668, so quite a while. But basically, these migrants flooded into the city, and this is a city that normally has a population of 80,000. So you can imagine the impact that it had. As you said, it started out with a small trickle, and then more and more people kept crossing over. And what Spanish authorities immediately detected was that the Moroccan border guards that normally work with the Spanish border guards to keep the city defended, they had essentially vanished from their posts. And so there was no one really monitoring on the other side. And thousands upon thousands of unauthorized migrants were seemingly drawn to one of the Moroccan beaches and were able to essentially just swim over to the Spanish beaches and come into the city.
How far is that? And obviously it's dangerous, isn't it? Because at least 70 people are believed to have died.
The latest fatality count is up to 88. Now, it's not a huge distance, but it is fairly deep water, and certainly for people who are not particularly good swimmers, for the elderly, for children, it is a real challenge. And then we have to keep in mind the number of people that were in the water. So we really did see very chaotic scenes and a very deadly situation, especially for unexperienced swimmers.
And Greg, in terms of that border and that suggestion that the Moroccans had deserted their posts, the Moroccan border guards, what more do you know from the African side about that, and indeed from the Moroccan government? What are they saying about that?
Well, we actually haven't heard anything formal, or we didn't hear anything formal from the Moroccan authorities until today, this morning. Even then, they absolutely have not mentioned that. It was a complete kind of deafening silence on that, which is not unsurprising. I think they're unlikely to suddenly say that they had taken their own border guards off. It's kind of created a bit of an ongoing media war between Algeria and Morocco, who are by no means friends in the first place. But Algerian media have really been pushing this narrative that Aitor was talking about, that these Moroccan guards were not there, and that this was specifically related to Morocco trying to stop or pressure Spain into changing its position on the Western Sahara. And after this trip that the Spanish Prime Minister made to Algeria recently, that it was a kind of response to that. Moroccan media on the other side are definitely not mentioning this, at least all sort of pro-government media, which is the majority of outlets, I would say. And they are pushing a narrative without citing any real figures or citing any sources that 60% of those who went into Ceuta, or Ceuta in Arabic, were Moroccan.
And Greg, who are these people then, apart from that? I mean, what do we know about them? Why were they so desperate at such immense risk to cross into Spain?
I think it's a really good question, and maybe Aitor can talk more about the kind of demographic makeup but what we've seen in media is that a vast number of them are Moroccan. Even Moroccan media, pro-government, is kind of talking about this. And it comes on the back of these major Gen Z protests, which incidentally in Arabic were just called the Gen Z protests, just a transliteration. And they that was talking about unprecedented levels of youth unemployment. That was talking about a kind of lack of opportunity. These are debates that we hear here in the UK, that we hear all around, but it really took to the streets in Morocco, and it was one of the biggest uprisings we saw in a very, very long time. So that accounts for a lot of the Moroccan people who are coming through. But, we've seen these videos of sub-Saharan African migrants who are still on beaches, and a lot of them in limbo because of not knowing how to get back to Morocco after this. And, according to UN figures, and in terms of the kind of interceptions that Morocco made last year, which was about 74,000 interceptions, about 58% of them were from West Africa, and only 12% of them were from North Africa.
So it's a really interesting situation because, again, we're still trying to get a clear picture as to what happened and what motivated these people to go over. As you were mentioning, the Moroccan Interior Minister has basically been the only person to go on the record about this. And what he alleged in a statement that he gave yesterday was that social media messages had spread claiming that Spain had relaxed the rules for migration. Now, the situation's a bit odd because a lot of the people who came over were not carrying any bags, were not carrying anything that you would conceivably think of bringing with you if you are going to flee your country and move elsewhere. And it does seem to recall a similar incident in 2021, which was a lot more small scale. In that case, only about 8,000 people came over. But in that instance, the circumstances were almost identical. The border guards on the Moroccan side disappeared, and what we got later on were reports that Moroccan authorities had actually encouraged people to go over, not even necessarily to migrate, but essentially go over and check out Ceuta. They were even reports that they had organized buses to take school children over to the city, very much just in an effort to flood the city with migrants and create a very uncomfortable situation for Spanish authorities. Now, again, we're still trying to figure out if that's what's happened this time around. but it is remarkable that within 24 hours of the initial surge of migrants, Spanish authorities reported that people were returning at a rate of around 125 people a minute. So it certainly doesn't sound like people who are looking for a long-term exodus, but rather more of a short-term excursion almost. It's a very, very strange situation.
Yeah, it's a very dangerous excursion at that.
Indeed.
Aitor, we've mentioned a minute ago, Greg mentioned the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez. What has the role been of the Spanish Prime Minister here? Prime Minister on the left, he's been under attack, criticised by some counterparts in the EU, notably Giorgia Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, but also by Donald Trump. They, I think, to boil it all right down, basically say, you're soft on migration, this is your fault. Is that broadly what he's being accused of?
Yeah, it's exactly that. Look, Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has made a career of molding himself into this kind of global progressive figure. As you no doubt recall, he's really hit back against Donald Trump with the war in Iran and forbidden American planes from using Spanish bases to attack. And the other thing that he's really stood out for in Europe is that he is actually a very enthusiastic defender of migration. And earlier this year, he announced a government scheme to grant legal status to what ended up being 1.2 million unauthorized migrants already living in Spain. And Sanchez's argument is that Spain is undergoing a demographic collapse, essentially, and that it needs these people who are already there, taking care of the elderly, working in shops, etc. Now, what was really remarkable about this situation in Ceuta is that what we saw were EU leaders immediately linking the crisis in Ceuta to that legalization scheme that I mentioned. And these two things could not be more different. To qualify for this legalization scheme, for starters, you would have had to already been living in Spain at the beginning of this year. The deadline for applications ended back in June. In other words, none of the people who crossed over would have even been eligible for this regularization. And yet, exactly as you were mentioning, leaders like Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, later the Finnish Interior Minister, even Sweden's Prime Minister, and of course, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, who is notably part of the social democratic movement that Pedro Sanchez is part of, she too really came down hard against Spain. So in Spain, the reaction has been very deep frustration on the part of authorities. They feel like the EU has failed to express sufficient solidarity with Madrid. And the Spanish authorities that I spoke to went out of their way to point out that the situation in Ceuta, even though the images are very shocking, is absolutely comparable to other situations that have taken place in Europe before. And if we recall, a few years ago, Belarus, for example, was sending through migrants and flooding the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and other Baltic states to create pressure. And then several years ago, we had similar instances with Turkey and Greece. In other words, this weaponization of migrants is not unique to this situation. And what we saw was a lot of frustration in Madrid that EU leaders moved first to criticize Spanish authorities rather than to express solidarity with what is a very uncomfortable situation for any EU leader, and especially an EU country that has the task of protecting the union's external borders.
Yeah, it's already bleeding through to UK politics as well, and discussions about the border of the UK and whether some of these people might eventually end up here. You know, these debates percolate through, don't they, and reverberate out across the continent.
I want to mention with that, because one thing that the Spanish authorities really insist on is that as you may know, within the EU, we have this Schengen area that actually covers 29 countries. And within this area, you can travel without a passport. It's essentially a free movement zone. So even though Spain is part of it, and technically Ceuta and the other Spanish autonomous city in northern Africa, Melilla, are part of it, they have special conditions whereby in order to travel to the Spanish mainland, you do have to have documents. In other words, none of these people would have made it over. They lacked the authorization to cross the Strait of Gibraltar. And crucially, both Spanish authorities and now EU authorities have confirmed that not a single one of these people made it on to the continent. So certainly the panic that was created in the rest of Europe, this idea that migrants were going to cross over to Spain and then eventually get to the UK, it's a fallacy. It's something that was never on the table, was never possible, and certainly has not happened.
Okay, thank you for that perspective. And also, it's worth pointing out the obvious, which is the UK is not in the Schengen zone either. And indeed, even when the UK was in the EU, it wasn't in the Schengen zone. Anyway, Greg, social media, has that played a role here in some way in terms of these people getting to this point and then crossing? What do we know about that?
Well, I mean, just quickly on Aitor's previous point about them not being part of the Schengen zone, I mean, it is so much more complicated than that, given that Gibraltar is now in the Schengen zone and is part of the UK, etc.
That's such a good point.
That, you know, it's not just one sort of, well, it is homogenous, but it's not just one kind of easily explainable place. On social media, I think it's definitely played a role, and that's a role that Moroccan media has really been trying to push. I was looking at some articles earlier where these kind of main pro-government, not kind of state-owned, but pro-government websites were describing it as a wildfire on social media. Another was saying that the wave of crossings towards occupied Ceuta did not begin at sea, but rather on a smartphone screen. So I think that for Moroccan media, they aren't pushing massively this idea that Spain was trying to attract people with these recent decisions. There has been some of that discourse, but I think it seems to be a kind of compromise position where they don't have any blame on the Moroccan authorities, while also trying to keep some cordial relations with Spain and not trying to rock the boat too much.
And just to bring it back to where we began, just to finish, have either of you heard from any of the migrants directly involved? Have we heard in their voices why they were doing this? And have we heard from the people in Ceuta about what they felt, about what was happening? Either of you?
So very much indirectly, but these people have been extensively interviewed on Spanish media, and just this morning I was listening to the radio. The comment that we heard repeated over and over again by some of the people who came over was that they had heard online, generally on TikTok, on social media, that it was the moment to cross over. But many of the people I listened to being interviewed admitted that they didn't really have a plan beyond that, and they weren't even sure if they necessarily wanted to cross over into Spain. They've also found a pretty impossible situation, because the reaction within the city was that the actual inhabitants of Ceuta essentially closed up shop. So a lot of the people who managed to make it over then found themselves in an empty city where they couldn't access food, shelter, anything like that. So it was a pretty rational decision for them to return back over the border as soon as that was possible. On the side of the actual residents of the city, they seem very upset given the amount of people that came in and the chaos that was lived there. And there is deep frustration on the part of authorities, like the city's mayor, who's also the autonomous president. He this morning openly stated that he no longer considered that Morocco was a reliable partner. And he expressed his very sincere doubts that, he said he believed that Morocco very likely had a role in it. And these are people who are very tired of being used as a geopolitical chess piece. They're exhausted. They're just trying to live their lives.
Yeah. And Greg, just finally, one thing I should have asked a lot earlier, were these all, or at least mostly, young men crossing over?
I mean, from the demographics that we've seen and from how it's described in media, it does suggest that it is that. And from the kind of reports that we've been seeing from inside Ceuta and the things that residents have been saying about the people that they've been seeing, I guess it might fit with a kind of wider point where both Spain and Morocco have been pushing this narrative that it links to the social media point, but they've been pushing this narrative that effectively it was these trafficking gangs that were trying to push on social media to get as many people there as possible. We do know that a lot of them do act in Morocco. You know, Morocco is constantly announcing on state media that it has dismantled another network of kind of trafficking, human trafficking from its coast. But I mean, it's hard to know exactly what the demographics of the people were at this point, because it's just all we can do is see from the images that we've seen.
Yeah, which were quite extraordinary. Look, thank you both so much for joining us on Newscast. Greg, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And Aitor, thank you very much indeed.
Always a pleasure.